truth,
love,
and the good.
Here we go.
Okay, welcome. Welcome back. This is the DTPHD Podcast. I am David Tian, Ph.D., and very honored to be joined again by Henry CHONG.
Hello.
Yeah. So first about me, for over the past 10 years, actually over 12 years now, I've helped over hundreds of thousands of people in over 87 countries attain success, happiness, and fulfillment in life, and specifically in relationships. So I started out as a professor of philosophy and psychology and Asian cultures, and then resigned from the university to found my dating coach company, and then transitioned from there into relationships counseling and more broadly, life coaching. So joined here by Henry CHONG, a man I've known since before he went to Oxford, and a man of the world, so to speak. So I'll leave it to him to introduce himself. Henry.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. Well, my name is Henry CHONG. I am the CEO of the Fusang Group, and we are a group that helps to families of substantive wealth look after their assets, administer their assets. And in doing that job, my travels take me to a whole number of different things, looking at a wide variety of investments. And in doing so, I also have a very deep personal interest in how people think, how they operate. I have degrees from Oxford in philosophy, politics, economics. I later on went to do behavioral science. And I find that the study of how humans think and operate and how that interacts with the economy is fundamentally important when making investment decisions. And I've known you, David, for a very long time, and I've always enjoyed our conversation, our wide-ranging conversations on all kinds of topics on life, love, and the universe. And so very happy to be here again for our second podcast.
Yeah, right. So thinking about the DTPHD Podcast and who I'd have as a second voice, the natural selection is Henry CHONG. So let's dive into it. Today we've selected as our topic status, and specifically why it's important, why it's not important, and status anxiety, status insecurity, and just status overall. So I'm going to kick it off with an idea about status. So it seems like, at least in the dating coach world or pickup artist world, a world that I'm trying to escape, but finds its tentacles in my life over and over, a very common concept there is status and the importance of status. And there's almost like a status obsession. And there are whole courses that are selling well now called status, and books called status. And it's sort of scary to me, on the one hand, being a student of the humanities and a professor of the humanities, but I also understand it, actually, as being a student of evolutionary psychology. So in evolution, when it comes to mating and attracting mates, because after all, that's all that we're, as biological beings, made for. Let's get that straight. So we're made for survival and replication at the most basic. And if we can't replicate, then we're sort of useless in terms of our genetic material, right? So our genes are always driving us forward for either survival or replication. And when it comes to replication, status matters a whole lot, because if you're low status, your chances of surviving in the savannah 100,000 years ago was a lot lower. And if you're low in the status hierarchy, you won't get many mating opportunities, if any. In fact, as a male, you probably won't get any. In fact, the research has shown that males who are in the lower 50% of the status hierarchy probably didn't mate. And so we are not their descendants. We're the descendants of males that were in the upper 50%, if not the upper 33% of males throughout human history. And therefore, we must have adapted or evolved the adaptive trait to have a drive for status. So just as we have a natural desire to eat sweet things because we are not adapted to deal with a world full of Krispy Kreme donuts on every corner, if we found some sweet thing 100,000 years ago, we better gobble it up because we wouldn't see it very often. Again, we're not adapted for the world now. We're adapted for the world 50,000 or 100,000 years ago. And one of the things that we would have brought with us is a drive to attain status within our small tribes, because people didn't live in large societies back then. That we were adapted for. So we're not adapted for living in a community bigger than 150 people or something like that, or maybe even less, maybe 15 people. So the drive to not be the lowest male on that totem pole made sense, because we would have no mating opportunities, and we would have low chances of survival relative to being the leader who can command all the resources and the sexual mating opportunities. So the drive for status makes sense. So that's how it makes sense. So the obsession among dudes who are trying to meet women, they'd be obsessed about status and their place in the hierarchy because they're trying to maximize their mating opportunities. That's a liberal way of putting, or like a generous way of putting it. So they want to make their status seem higher than their natural status, where they naturally would fall or would naturally be at that moment. They want to artificially increase their status, and hence the status obsession. But that's coming from the mating perspective. But I also see it coming from people who are just trying to make it in business, or just trying to make it as an entrepreneur, in his 20s. And this seems like a really popular thing right now with the hustle and grind subculture, the entrepreneurial, like the 20-something entrepreneurial subculture. And the sort of like this valorization of the startup subculture is the idea of status, of trying to make it in the world. And that usually means like billions of dollars, some kind of exit around that level to make yourself feel like you've made it. And it's scary because, first of all, it does away with the whole meaning of life, right? So we can talk about that from the humanities perspective. But also just from a straight science perspective, there's pretty decent empirical evidence to show that our happiness doesn't track our material wealth beyond a certain number, 75,000, which is from, there's a well-known scientist who put that out there.
Yes, that was the happiness hypothesis, Jonathan Haidt.
Oh, right. In the book,
Yes.
The Happiness Hypothesis, he reports it, but it was like I think it was a Nobel Prize winning social scientist. Anyway, so there's that a number of 75,000 per year, and that was a few years ago at least. And so now it might be 80,000 or whatever. But beyond that certain number, which is relatively, that's upper middle class, but it's not unattainable for many people. But beyond that, happiness increases only marginally, and then at a certain level, it starts to decrease or flatline. So there's a lot of, and even before any of that research, there's a lot of philosophers and theorists, you could say, theorists, we'll just call them philosophers or theorists, who posited, and many of them were from a religious background, posited that the meaning of life could not lie in accumulating more material possessions or in climbing the status hierarchy. And yet, it seems like most of the world, especially the people in my market, young men who in their 20s and 30s who are trying to make it in the world and who feel insecure, they latch on to status as the end-all, be-all that will save them from their current fate. And just wanted to muse on this a bit.
Yeah. Well, I think happiness, a bit like status, a bit like happiness, is something that is very hard to pursue directly. And people who try and pursue status directly are usually, at least the way we see them, people of low status, right? People who try almost a bit too hard. Just like happiness, John Stuart Mill said you have to approach it sideways, like a crab. If you spend all day trying to be happy, you never will be happy. You need to go out and do other things, and happiness will come to you, as a byproduct of doing all those other things. I think status is the same way. You need to go out and do productive things, add value to the world, be someone who has expertise, deep expertise in a skill, some kind of something that you can give out into the world. And if you can produce in that way, status will come to you. Status, money, and happiness. If someone says, I want to be a legendary mountain climber so that I will have status and everyone will recognize me and I will be famous, you will never become a legendary mountain climber because it's very hard. And it requires a great deal of intrinsic motivation to get you to where, the peak of that profession, like any profession. So I think it's extremely hard to pursue status directly. And I think that's the mistake a lot of people make. A lot of the people that you're talking about, for example, by maximizing for status first and foremost, they don't end up taking the time to, for example, gain deep mastery at a specific skill and become, one of the best in the world at a specific skill. They don't take the time to gain the discipline needed, in the daily pursuit of whatever their chosen path is. And at the end of the day, I think something within us is wired to recognize that, to see people who are not, taking an action for any kind of intrinsic motivation, but purely because of how they think it'll make them look, right? We seem to have some kind of natural aversion to those kind of people.
So that's a good point. So you're saying, even if you were to pursue status, so like a lot of the spiel that I started with was attacking the pursuit of it at all. But you're saying even if you to get it at all, like if you're going to aim for it, even aiming for it is not the way to get it. And that's a great point. And it's like you're saying, it's like happiness. And in a way, this is like the pursuit of fame, right? Like a lot of people think if they're famous, then they'll get money, then they'll get the girls, then they'll get, the big gangster life. And what they end up having to do is to fake it right? They're faking that they're something. And it's maybe you can think, people who are listening can think back to like when they've seen somebody fake status.
Yeah.
This happens a lot in nightclubs, right? Like they try to be bigger than they are, or somebody like they're more important than they are, richer than they are.
Yeah.
So they'll try really hard to like they'll buy clothes but they don't seem to be very comfortable with them. But there's some bullshitters, right? Who can take it pretty far. What happens to those people?
I mean, I certainly in the short term, it can most certainly work, right? We don't live, as you say, in tribes of 150 people anymore, right? We live in a large world. And when you encounter people for the first time, it's entirely possible to fake it, so to speak. The problem is it's hard to sustain that over a long period of time. People eventually figure it out. And I was saying earlier that we have some kind of intrinsic dislike for these kind of people. And I think some of it is due to the way we're wired for trust and reciprocity in an intrinsic sense. And we can talk a bit more about the evolutionary reasons why things like trust and reciprocity are so important, right? Once upon a time, if you're living in a tribe of 150 people, if I hunt a deer, I have more meat than I know what to do with. I need to share. And I share because I know that you will reciprocate when you, David, you go out and catch a deer and I haven't caught anything. And that's why, for example, reciprocity is not linear. It's why trust is such an important part of the way our society works. A lot of people, it becomes too much about quid pro quo, and the world doesn't quite work that way, right? The world works by building relationships, by building trust. This is the most fundamental glue that holds society together. And we have a natural aversion to people who try and upset this balance, right?
Right. So trust and reciprocity. So you're talking about like authentic status in some way, and then there's just a version of it which is inauthentic status. And,
exactly.
Right. So let's a good time to back out a bit and talk about what status actually is referring to. So biologically, there's a way to think about the hierarchy, and you were saying maybe before we press record about how in the animal kingdom or early man or smaller societies, status was a lot more linear versus what it is now. Like, what is status actually trying to track, or what is it? What does it track? Is it? It's not just money, though people think that it is now, and that's a very American view of status. How could if someone were to fake status, what are they actually faking?
Yeah, I think it's a bit more contextualized in today's world. Again, we live in a big world with technology, with things that have become quite diverse. Our communities are no longer local, right? You can have an online community of people who follow you on Instagram, which is a perfectly valid community. So I think status is relative, but still, I think at its core, it relies on your ability to add value in some way to your community, right? Because whatever it is, that's a much more idealistic view of it than I think. Well, so it should be, right? But I mean, value doesn't have to be a moral, a judgment of whether that value is good or not, right? But put it this way, I challenge you to name one person who has achieved, quote unquote fame by just wanting to be famous or pursuing fame without actually having any kind of underlying skill. Even people we think of as being famous for being famous, like perhaps the Kardashians, still have a very unique skill, right? They are very good at social media, right? And they are very good.
The value they're adding there is an entertainment value.
Yeah, but that's what I mean, right? So it doesn't have to be a judgment about whether this value is, there are people who add value who might be lower status. So like Doctors Without Borders, right? So these people that toil relatively anonymously. Name one person who's part of that organization besides the head, right? Maybe you know your friend who's in it, but like they're not famous because they just don't get spread. Yeah. So there are people who do valuable things and do valuable work that people don't hear about. And in terms of status, they might actually be considered by the society as a low thing. So you said it's relative, and that's a really important point. So your status is determined by your peers, your peers being your community. And then within the community, not everybody's equal. So you have some people who are the thought, or they're the influencers, so to speak, looking for a better term than that, but they're the ones who influence most of other people's things. So they have a disproportionate control over, or say over what is considered to be of value, right? So your status is always going to be relative to the community that you want to peg it to.
So you want to have a higher status within your school would be very different from somebody who's having a higher status in the nightclub,
Yeah.
right? Those would be very different types of people, probably, depending on what your schools or nightclub are like, but probably, the average ones would be quite different. And so I think what status is like, if you think about influence or authority. So a good way to think about it is where status and or wealth come apart. So you could have somebody who is, or like nowadays, you might have the royal families, and they may not be very rich, right? They just have like status, like people recognize them, they respect them, and they probably get a lot of perks that don't come along with just paying for stuff. Right? So they live in this great palace, and they get all these tax breaks and and all these other perks that if you were to buy them outright with cash would be a lot more expensive than whatever they're paying for. And another one is actually famous people, because there are some billionaires that we would never recognize, like that we just don't know. Like unless you might you see the name in the Forbes list, but you don't know what they look like, and you wouldn't be able to tell them on the street. But then you have somebody who's maybe only net worth of maybe 20 million. I think Conor McGregor, before he fought Mayweather, his net worth was assessed around 25 million or something like that, and he's a lot poorer compared to anybody in the Forbes lists. And yet we know his face and his name and all that stuff because, he's famous. So fame and riches come apart. But where's his status, right? So like what happens when you become famous is you get a lot of free stuff. So you walk into a nightclub and they throw you all this free stuff. And that's a reaction to your status. It's not a reaction just to your money. So then status is just assessed relative to the status makers. Oh, that's a good term, like status assessors. And the masses, if the masses have a voice, are usually the one that the final say. So like if there are 1 million people who followed you on Instagram, you have more status, say, than somebody who has 100 people on his Instagram. All right, so this is like a crude way of assessing status. So when a guy's trying to fake status or thinks the status is the end all be all of his life, what will happen to his life is he, like you were saying, he might be able to fake it for a while, but people will figure it out. And then when that happens, not only is he like does the house of cards falls, but like his life his life falls, because even when he's making it, here's another thing, even when he's making it, people who fake status, the only people who will be duped by it are other fake people. And if there are enough fake people all faking status, they'll come into, I think what happens is they come into cahoots with each other. So you see this at a local level in nightclubs. So there are enough fake people there, and they're trying to fake that they have a lot of money. And a bunch of fakers get together, and they either explicitly or implicitly make a pact, which is like, hey, let's pretend to be cooler and have more money than we do. So we'll chip in on this table. We'll hack the system so it makes it look like we have more money and so on than we do, and we'll pool our resources. And none of those, so unless those were friends that were from way back, but probably not if you're club friends, are all fake friends. And the moment that you break with the pact, or they find that you can't uphold your end of the fake status bargain, they're going to drop you. So a lot of people in the clubbing world or the pickup artist world or any kind of like status obsessed world are surrounded by fake people, fake friends, who have they shouldn't really be trusting them. Going back to trust and reciprocity, right? Reciprocity is there because like, as long as you continue to push up or uphold my status, my fake status, I'll uphold your fake status. And so we'll just like lie about, about each other to girls as the example there. And we'll keep that going until the girls figure it out. And then we have to move on to new victims. But these friends of yours, just like clubbing friends, like the average clubbing friends, are going to be fake. And so it creates a circle around you and a life around you that's fake. Right? You have even like if you get as a celebrity lots of free stuff or respect or adoration, the moment the status goes away because people find out that you don't deliver the kind of value that they think you deliver or they thought you delivered, those people will go away as well. Right? So and what I see a lot, and I have this separate Facebook group because there's another show I do called Man Up. And we have a Man Up Facebook group, and you can join that. And there's 18,000 people in there right now. And a lot of the guys, every week or so, we have 2 or 3 people who complain that they don't have friends. Like, and they say often the refrain is, I did have friends, but they turned out to be fake friends. And I think everyone's just in it for themselves. And I'm not sure there's no real question in there. They're just looking for some kind of validation, or I don't know. People who like this usually are bitter. And one of the reasons why they find themselves surrounded by fake people is because they're being fake themselves. Right? And that's the obsession over status will breed that kind of fakeness.
At the same time, I think we also need to realize that we're making value judgments about those kind of people who hang out in nightclubs. So your value is extremely limited to that context. Now, as long as that is the kind of status that you're pursuing, right, and what you want to maximize for, so be it. But the minute you leave that context, as you say, you lose all that status. But intrinsically, it's pretty similar to Conor McGregor. He has a lot of status because he is a UFC fighter. If he decides to go from being a UFC fighter to becoming someone who works for Doctors Without Borders, his status will be very different in that environment. I think the key is to realize what value is valuable to you. What kind of status are you trying to maximize for? The problem is a lot of people go and try and maximize their value in a nightclub environment when that's not really what they care about, right? If that's your life, if you run a nightclub, right, so be it. But I
would still say, like, just for human beings in general, if that they shouldn't, like what you're saying as well, they shouldn't care about, they shouldn't aim for status, because even if that's what you want, you're not going to get it by aiming for it. But in addition, if you do want status, what I'm saying is it will lead to an unfulfilling life. So status can be something that you have given to you by your context, and that might be nice to have, and once in a while you might revel in it somehow. But you don't want to stay there for too long, because if you think about your status too long, you're going to get sucked into getting more of it. Right. And that becomes some kind of metric in your life of how to measure your success or your progress. And so it's dissatisfying, not just in terms of the people that you draw into your life, but also internally, the mental gymnastics you have to go through. So you're quite right in pointing out the nightclub. I met my wife in the nightclub. And I have plenty of friends who enjoy nightclubs. I enjoy nightclubs, given the right state of mind that you enter it into. I think a lot of club owners know the game, like they have to game that system. They know that these people who are buying them drinks wouldn't have bought drinks for this guy, the owner, if he weren't the owner. Like they're not. I don't think any smart nightclub person is under any illusions about the truthfulness of that friendship. And that's why it's actually hard to get through to them and become their personal friend. And they're constantly screening you and testing you to see whether you're really a friend. And one way to if you want to really go all the way, like a good, what's that movie with it's Matt Damon and Talented Mr. Ripley, where you're you keep the ruse up all the way to the end, which is you infiltrate that influential person's personal life. It's sort of like undercover, like an undercover cop would for gangs or whatever. And you win over their approval. Actually, gangs are a really good test case for status. I mean, that's pretty raw status right there. If you're the top dog, you get to kill other people, right? Like you get to order them to chop off fingers and things. But anyway, so then you infiltrate that personal life. So you hang out with them on a Sunday afternoon with their kids and the dog and all that. And then they start to think, okay, you're truthful. But the whole, what they're really looking for is the authenticity that you were pointing out, Henry, with the trust and reciprocity. But I wanted to also point out that the inner life of somebody like that really suffers, because there's a diagnostic, there's a textbook for psychiatrists, the DSM, and we're up to DSM-5 now. And there's a helpful taxonomy in DSM of psychological disorders. And there's one that's quite pervasive in the cluster B set of disorders, which is the narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the hallmarks of a narcissistic personality disordered individual is obsession over status, which is the constant thought of, what do other people think of me? How am I being perceived in this situation now, here, and in the future, and back then? And this obsession about how others perceive him or her. And you might start off as a non-disordered, narcissistic personality disordered individual. You're just insecure, right? And then your way to get over the insecurity, and maybe you just want more friends, and maybe you want more sex from good-looking people, is to act and think in a certain way. And that was really dangerous. So just the context for why status makes sense in the pickup artist world is it gets you the first steps, because if somebody who doesn't fit into nightclubs or cool settings at all suddenly starts to dress like somebody who does, right? So he doesn't know why he's wearing those clothes because that his aesthetic sense is not caught up to that or has not become that yet. But he's just ordered by a fashion stylist, wear these clothes in this way and go out there, right? So he does it like a robot. He just puts on the clothes, gets a new haircut. And it's not him yet, though. He hasn't owned it. He doesn't even know why. He doesn't even like the look in the mirror, but he's just told to put it on. So he puts it on and goes out there. Well, people will start to look at him. They'll consider him like he fits in one of their own. So he'll get that initial pinging of status or the validation, right? So then thinks this is working. And then he'll start to talk like them. He'll mimic their styles of speech and the content, and so he starts to fake it. He starts to fake as if he is one of them. Inside, he's just really like thinking, okay, they like X, so I will do X. And really, what's happening is he starts to get that thought pattern of what do they like, what do they see me, how do they see me now? How do they perceive me? How are they judging me? How are they evaluating me? And he's constantly thinking about that because he hasn't actually arrived at the aesthetic sensibility that they have for appreciating the intrinsic nature of the things that bring status and value in that context. He's just mimicking it. And what's interesting is the structure of the thought process creates a narcissistic personality disordered person. Like it creates a disorder in him. I know from personal experience because I went through that and I got really good at that. And one of the reasons I got really good at it because I got into their minds and the minds of the audience, so to speak, and the minds of the target market and figured out what they like. And I just was able to mimic that. Eventually I went all the way and was able to adopt thought patterns that they had. And it was really scary because most of the people in those environments have narcissistic personality disordered thought patterns, which are along the lines of, what do people think of me? How can I impress others? So the more you study NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, the more you find out how awful their inner lives are, because in fact, they can never be truly fulfilled. Because anybody who's obsessed with the question has as the driving force of their lives, what do other people think of me? Now, imagine that were your primary question that you woke up with every day. You would never be secure and certain in your life because that's always a big unknown. You're always pinging. Do they like me today? Oh, good. They like me today. Today, I'm allowed to be happy and to feel good about myself and so on. And your self-esteem is always at the mercy of other people. And you don't know yourself. Like you're not the center of your own values. Your values are centered around other individuals. They get to tell you how to feel about yourself and about anything, really. They get to tell you how to feel. So somebody who is obsessed about status goes down the road of unhappiness and lack of fulfillment, not just the fact that he's now going to surround himself with fake people, but also because of his inner life is now going to be his primary questions are driving him towards dissatisfaction.
And because he doesn't intrinsically enjoy the environment that he's in, right? He's living a life because of some kind of externally referenced values, right? Not because of internally referenced values. And that's why I say, you shouldn't run a nightclub because you think it'll bring you status. You should run a nightclub because you enjoy running a nightclub. Right? And if you really do intrinsically enjoy running a nightclub and you're willing to have the discipline and put in the time to learn the skills necessary, because it's a skill like anything else in the world, if you're willing to do that, you'll get good at it. And if you get really good at it, you'll probably have a lot of status as a nightclub owner specifically. And that's why I think it is important that you understand that the value is contextualized and you do need to deliver value, right? Being a good nightclub owner delivers value to people who want to go to nightclubs. And that's why you cannot pursue status directly. Instead, you have to start with saying, what is it that I want to do? What is it that I enjoy doing intrinsically? For example, Conor McGregor, if he became a UFC fighter because he said, I want to be famous, he wouldn't have got very far. It's not an easy road. But instead, he said, I want to be the best fighter that ever lived. And because of that, because he was willing to put in the time and the dedication and the training day in, day out, now that he is one of the best fighters in the world, he has plenty of status. But still, to be honest, contextualized to that environment. He has a lot of status as a UFC fighter. Instead, you look at someone like Ronda Rousey, right, who I'm sure at one point was extremely intrinsically motivated, right? Olympic, she was in the Olympics. She was, had this incredible winning streak in the UFC. But I think that at some point it shifted for her. At some point, she became more afraid about looking after that winning streak, about not losing, than she really did about just intrinsically wanting to be the best fighter possible. And you can see that because the minute she lost, it just destroyed her, right? That identity of having this perfect record was so much more important to her than just the intrinsic, joy and value of being a good fighter and enjoying fighting. And to be honest, you look at Conor McGregor, he really enjoys fighting.
That's a great point about, so what you hinted at earlier, the if you were like the best way to actually get status, and the reason why people are usually obsessed with status is because they think that status will bring them certain emotions or goods, like mating opportunities, like respect from others, which will get them more validation, which will make them feel like they're finally significant and worthy enough in life. So the way to get that, those feelings of significance and of enjoyment and mating opportunities, they think are through status. So let's think about status as a byproduct of doing something contributing value to your society, to the community. And the way to do that, you're saying, is to actually to take it to the highest levels, is to find something that you enjoy intrinsically. And then you'll have the persistence and the tenacity to break through all of the different plateaus that would be there naturally, and to get that high level and that skill. What if the thing that you choose to pursue because you enjoy it, what if the thing that you intrinsically enjoy isn't valued much by the community? So let's say, like somebody who really loves Smurfs, that's Gary Vaynerchuk's example, or let's say you really love playing checkers, so that's not like really cool these days, but you really love it. What happens to that? Like, what should that person be doing, do you think?
Well, but see, that right there, that's the question, right? So if you say, I intrinsically love Smurfs, but I don't want to pursue my Smurfdom or whatever, because there's not a lot of status in it, again, you're approaching it from the wrong way, right? Now you're concerned more about the status than the intrinsic, joy of the activity, right? If you say, look, I enjoy checkers, the honest truth is someone who is the best checker players in the world will never make as much money as the best hedge fund manager in the world, but that's my path, right? That's what I want to get good at. You can be the best checkers player in the world and have a lot of status in that world. And checkers players the world over will go, wow, he is the best. And you'll have a lot of status localized in that context and in that community. But if you say, you know what, I want to play, I just want to gain status, I want to play checkers because I gain status, well, to be honest, you're probably never going to get very far. Anything in the world to be the best in the world at is not easy, right? There are plenty of people out there who are professional checkers players, and it's not easy like anything else. It takes a huge amount, not just time and dedication, but willing to suffer, quite frankly, all the not fun bits. I'm sure being a nightclub owner on the surface sounds appealing to many people, but it's a lot of late nights. I know I have lots of friends who run nightclubs, and it's not easy. It's a pretty hard life. The drinking, it's long hours like any job, and sometimes it's just a grind.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So let's bring out value more, because that's the thing you pointed out as at the beginning. So there's intrinsic enjoyment of an activity. Let's say blogging about Smurfs and in the Smurf fan world. And Gary Vaynerchuk's example was like, in 2009, he gave this talk that was picked up by TED, and then it became viral on if you love Smurfs, then Smurf it up. And then a couple of years later, the Smurfs movie came out, and he made another video about how like the top Smurfs blogs were getting some sponsorship money from, I think it was Disney or whatever, to promote the movie. And their time had come. They finally could make money off this blog that no one paid any attention to. And suddenly they were cool again for a little while. And so that was his example. And there is a way, like, let's say you can think of some examples of people who became famous doing things that you would never have thought would have been cool, but got picked up because of the right way of marketing. And value is that way. So if you are the world's best chess player, but you only play in closed rooms with no recordings, and the only way you'd ever hear about them is through the newspaper, like the score, right? Because they didn't allow anybody to record it, and they didn't do any interviews or whatever. Then they aren't providing value to the society. You might be really good at something, but if you don't provide value to others, you shouldn't expect others to reward you for that, right? So this is the reason why Conor McGregor, even though he's marginally better or worse than GSP, ended up making a ton more money than the top fighters in the UFC, was because he understood marketing really, really well, branding really, really well. And he was able to provide that extra entertainment value, which was like the disproportionate amount of the money is coming in through that, to that world. And so now he's making boxing money because he was able to do that. And a lot of the fighters who are pure fighters, who never want to give interviews, they don't want to talk to the media, they don't want to play up their personalities, they just want to fight, are going to be getting the 50,000 to show and 50,000 to win or whatever it is, when Conor McGregor is making 10 million in the UFC, for a fight, and now even 10x that. So there's a separate move strategically, like in business, from providing being good at that skill to making it to monetizing it, right? So when you want to monetize, and the marketing comes in, and a big part of status and branding is your personal brand, your personal marketing, right? Of yourself, your presentation of yourself, how often you're in the minds of your market. And this is something I used to teach as part of like nightclub game. There are ways of keeping yourself in the minds of the people that you want to aim for, and there are ways of presenting yourself so that so that you're basically marketing and branding yourself in that context. And that will take you to that next level to get the status. But if no one hears about you and you're toiling away on your own, and you're really good at the skill, and you have intrinsic enjoyment of it, but you're not getting rewarded, think about the next thing to do is to think about marketing it. How do you present it so that it gives even more value to even more people? And then you'll get rewarded at some point. Yeah. That's the idea, as far as making money off the thing that you really enjoy.
Well, that's also what I mean by when you say adding value, you need to think long and hard about add what kind of value to who, right? Again, you need to take an unvarnished, no bullshit look at what is it you do. Conor McGregor understands that a lot of the value he provides is entertainment value, right? More so even than winning the fights. And because he understands that and he understands how to exploit it, he delivers a lot of value to people like me, who quite frankly are just, armchair fans of the UFC and of fighting, but we enjoy watching his fights. So that's what I mean by a lot of times people want to ascribe value judgments to what people do. But the question is, rather than worry about what people think, just say, again, what do I intrinsically enjoy doing? What can I get, what can I become one of the best in the world at doing? And how can I then deliver value to other people by doing this? Right? You can be one of the best chess players in the world. And there are lots of ways, as you say, of marketing and branding these days. You can start a Twitch channel or a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Right? You can, you can teach young people how to play chess, or you can just provide, entertainment to the world by saying, this is an example of chess being played at the very highest of levels. Right. But whatever it is that you do need those elements. It's not enough to just say, yeah, I want to provide entertainment value to people if I intrinsically don't enjoy doing it, because then you'll never be very good at it. There have been a lot of fighters who, everyone knows that, right? As a fighter, you understand that you've got to sell your fights, but most people aren't very good at it and don't enjoy doing it. And so they just don't actually provide the value. Conor McGregor enjoys providing that entertainment as much as he enjoys fighting. And that's why he's gotten quite good at it.
Yeah. And I think that's his natural personality. It was just this big, brash personality. So he's not actually taking any extra effort to act in a certain way. He's just acting as himself and then just showing up for interviews. Of course, showing up for interviews is a big deal when you have that many interviews. Yep. But you get put in the hustle. But it's him. It's him being, well, as far as we can tell, to keep up that level of media. He's being himself. Here's just one piece of hope. I don't know, I'll give a little hope to the guys who are listening from my world, or my former world, who are nerds, and they feel like the things that they intrinsically enjoy and the value that they can provide to the society is not enjoyed or valued by their target female market, right? So the hot girls that they want to impress and all that. So that's why they had that switch, right? Like I started off as a PhD at the time as a PhD student, who was very geeky and had very argumentative a personality. So I was a debater, and I loved to debate philosophy and psychology. And the nerds who, like me, who had to go from something that the target audience didn't like into something that they did like, and to make that transition to enjoy it intrinsically, there's a big switch there. And so now looking back, I would say to people, because I coached guys to do that for over a decade, it's really hard. For the average person, or even for 80% of the people who attempt this, it's really hard as an adult to switch your interests from one extreme to the other, or from that drastically. And from being geeking out over Plato and Aristotle to geeking out over Kanye West, if you didn't enjoy Kanye West's music or Eminem before that. And one way to take that Gary Vaynerchuk point of the Smurfs, right? He said 2 years later, there was a Smurfs movie and they came calling, and you had better been ready with your blog from years back. Because if you suddenly jump on that bandwagon, no one's going to buy it and they're not going to sponsor you. But if you've been blogging and became the number one Smurfs blog, they would have then gone to you for sponsorships and promotions because you are already established. So here's what I want to the takeaway I give guys now, which is pursue the things that you intrinsically enjoy, because even if you don't become famous or rich off it, as in the capitalist world, in the capitalist economy, you'll be able to make enough to live. Like, so yeah, like the original point that I had, I think it was Kahneman or who did the research on the 75,000 a year. Anyway, so there's at a certain point, which at that point it was $75,000 a year. Beyond that, there was only a marginal increase in happiness, and then it leveled off. If you can make 75,000 if you really hustle at the thing that you enjoy, or you can do that at night and then take a job, that whatever. But if you're spending your time doing something you intrinsically enjoy, even if you're not monetarily rewarded for it, you're still going to enjoy life. And there's some things that maybe you won't get, like hot chicks or whatever, but you're going to enjoy life. So if you just sell your soul to get the hot chicks, you're going to hate yourself later anyway. And the hot chicks thing is like eating a lot of ice cream. It just becomes old after a while. But but then the point that Gary Vaynerchuk is making is maybe you will hit it big. And here's an example. It became really cool, and people in their 20s won't remember this, but older people will. It wasn't cool to say that you were an entrepreneur. And not like I'm 40 now. So when I was Henry's age, when that entrepreneur meant that you were unemployed, you didn't have a job and you had no future, right? So entrepreneur meant unemployed. Now it means like something cool, because there's a like 20-something-year-old Zuckerberg and people like him who wore a hoodie and became billionaires. And now it's like this whole startup culture, which is really cool, wear your jeans to work and all that. That's a pretty relatively new thing in human history. And it wasn't cool. And they made nerds cool. Okay, so they made coding cool. They made that subculture cool. And maybe you'll be that, probably not, but like you never know when the cultural shift will occur, so that the thing that you intrinsically enjoy will become cool. And in the meantime, you can learn marketing and branding to make it cool, to bring more value and to draw in a bigger audience for that thing that you enjoy. And that's something I've been really hammering home to my philosophy friends and my professor friends, that the reason you're making only this much money from the university is because society generally in a capitalistic economy only values your work that little. Like you teach 2 courses a term to a grand total of 30 students or whatever. That's how much value you bring. In fact, you're probably overpaid given the value you bring. And you write books that maybe 50 people in the whole world read, and articles that maybe 20 people read or less. And if you want to get rewarded more in a capitalist economy, bring more value to more people. That means you're going to have to, instead of being a purist about your work, you're going to have to look for ways to bridge that divide. But in the meantime, maybe you can just bide your time until whatever it is that you do enjoy and are good at becomes cool. And that might come along but in the meantime, you're going to really enjoy the time that you have on this earth because you're doing something you intrinsically enjoy.
Exactly. And if you intrinsically enjoy something, I mean, if you get to wake up every day and do something that you love doing, what do you care if you get the fame or the status? If you actually think about it, like what is the successful life, right? Isn't it getting to do what you want to do, when you want to do it, with who you want to do it? And if you get to do that every day, who cares about the other stuff? In fact, personally, I would much rather be successful and not famous at all. For a lot of people, fame is the negative thing that comes that is unavoidable because of your chosen profession. If you're an actor, being successful and being famous go hand in hand. I'm willing to bet a lot of them would actually prefer if they could have one without the other, because fame comes with a lot of burdens.
Yeah.
Right? It's not necessarily the easiest of lives. Again, I personally would much rather do what I want to do and not have anyone notice. Yeah. The problem, of course, is that again, if you're a philosophy professor, for example, and you do want to be adding value to a lot of people, then maybe it means that you need to figure out how to communicate what you teach in a way that is accessible to a whole lot of people. You could easily be a philosophy professor, and if you have some niche area of philosophy that you make so interesting and so accessible to millions of people, and you have millions of views on your YouTube channel, right? That's adding value. And you probably will become famous and get a lot of status for doing it, whether you like it or not.
Actually, professors are a great example, especially philosophers, of the local community, having status within the local community versus having status in the greater community. Because a lot of especially young professors, feel that they need to follow their senior professors. And the senior professors, especially in philosophy, really pride themselves on being understandable, like unapproachable. Like their work shouldn't have, like especially in America, Anglo-American philosophy should not be relevant to real life, because if it were, it wouldn't be philosophy. A lot of senior philosophers believe that. And so like there was a time when they were enjoying status within the university community, and maybe broadly speaking, like you get a Kripke type, like a Princeton philosopher of language, for instance, who is very famous within the small world of philosophy, but no one outside that knows him and doesn't really give a damn. And so like if your community shrinks, then you want status within that little community, but then don't be wondering why you're not getting rewarded more by the outside community if you're shafting them. And I'll end with a story because we've gone way over time. I was recently in North America. I was there for 2 months in the West. And one thing I discovered was that when I dressed like the way I dressed in Thailand, ironically, which is still a developing country, with my Hermes bracelet, that became a thing, like wearing with my Tom Ford suit. And I have these chrome hearts, a ring and a necklace, that actually attracted the wrong type of person on the street. Like I was approached over and over by beggars, like, well, not beggars, it's the wrong word, but like I kind of got picked on. And because I looked like a good target, for like handouts or to be made felt guilty or whatever. If I'm just walking down the wrong street, and there were a lot of wrong streets in New York and even in Toronto, surprisingly. So what I discovered is when I'm in the West, that is like, especially North America, I shouldn't have status displays. In fact, it would be better to dress down a lot. So I'd walk around town in Converse and just plain blue jeans and, and a plain t-shirt, and then I wouldn't get bothered. And that was just a weird thing, because like, when do you want to make it look like you have less status than you actually do? That's an interesting question. When is it that you have so much status that you want to have lower status? And like a celebrity, like you were mentioning, Henry, like an actor who wants to blend in and go watch a movie in an actual theater with the public would have to like go in camouflage, with the hoodie and the whole thing, dressed down a lot. And you see this in the paparazzi. They're trying to avoid the paparazzi and sneak off to Starbucks and order a drink, and they have to blend in. And like I think it's not that difficult for us to imagine how fame would be unpleasant to live with. And it's a nice wake up call to realizing when you have real status, you want to fake low status in order to weed out certain people. Right, you don't want to attract certain people, gold diggers or whatever, people who are going to try to take advantage of you. And then the people who stick around are there for you, really, like for you as a person. So you look for people who you can actually trust. So then we come back to your initial point about trust and reciprocity. Yes.
Well, not just that, but a lot of people, the people who are truly high status because you can walk into a black tie event wearing jeans and a hoodie, like Mark Zuckerberg. Right? If you can go meet the president wearing your iconic, black t-shirt, blue jeans outfit, ironically, that's you displaying the highest of status when you say, I can afford to take myself out of the game altogether. Yeah. And maybe just one last story to end on that I think is just interesting is, there's this old story about how once upon a time there was this Mexican fisherman, and he's lying on the beach and he's playing his guitar, and he's sitting in his hammock by the ocean, and this young newly minted Harvard MBA student comes over and says, hey, look, let me teach you about how to be successful, right? I mean, a lot of people have probably heard this story, and this fisherman says, okay, well, what should I do? And this MBA says, well, you need to be working longer hours so that you can go out and you can catch more fish. You get more fish, it means you get more money. And the fisherman says, okay, what next? He says, oh, well then, okay, once you catch more fish, you make more money, you can buy a second boat. You have a second boat, you hire someone to work for you. Now you're making even more money by catching even more fish. And this goes on, and he gets a fleet of ships. And then the MBA says, and then you need to go up the production chain, right? You go into distribution and marketing and packaging and canning, and then you move into retail. So you're selling your fish directly to the consumers, right? The guy says, oh, well, what then? He says, well, then you can IPO your company, you can sell it all, you can make millions of dollars. And then the fisherman says, okay, and what's next? He says, well, then you can retire and lead a life of luxury, lying on the beach in your hammock, playing the guitar, watching the ocean. And I've always liked that story where a lot of people, after the whole circle, you come right back to where you started. And a bit like you're saying, a lot of people, you chase status so that one day you can just wander around wearing jeans and a t-shirt and no one will bother you. And I've always thought that quite interesting. Yeah,
sounds right, man. I like that. All right, so we've gone over time. Always a joy talking to my main man, Henry Chong. This is David Tian signing out, and we'll see you in the next podcast.
Yep. Take care, everybody.
Before you go, a couple last things. First, all the show notes and links to resources can be found at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD Podcast. Or you can just go to davidtianphd.com and find it through the top navigation menu. Second, if you'd like to interact with me or other like-minded fans of the podcast, then join our private DTPHD Podcast Facebook group. We've got an awesome community of intelligent, wise individuals from literally all around the world. You can send a join request to the group using the link you'll find in the show notes of every podcast at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD Podcast. Click the link, log into your Facebook, and then click to join. We approve join requests every day. So go to davidtianphd.com and click the link to join. See you inside our group.